Hey folks, sorry for the long layoff, but as I'm sure you're all aware, 2020 was a bit of a year for everyone. Looking back on my own personal experience, it wasn't really that bad on paper. My programming business wasn't affected by the pandemic, and so far, I've not gotten COVID, nor has anyone in my immediate family. However, watching the world continually try and find new ways to set itself on fire has been exhausting. With that in mind, I wanted to talk a little bit about something you can do when you're feeling uninspired or creatively blocked. I'm talking about OPP. Yes, that's right, other people's projects. When you can't think of something interesting to make, it can be helpful to go through sites like Instructables, Make CNC, Cut Rocket, and even Etsy to find new projects to try. Don't be afraid to pay for a project. A lot of the paid projects are more well thought out and can be informative to your own processes. Building someone else's project can often inspire you to try variations or even open you up to new ideas for exploration. In my case, this led me to a project off of Etsy with the unlikely title of Process 23. This is from a shop called Benitum Art, run by a Lithuanian artist who has a real gift for textures and CNC art. The artist sells two basic types of art files, vectors for carve and 3D texture models. I'll probably do one of the texture models in another video, but for now, let's look at the vectors for carve. As you can see, there's a huge selection of interesting options. Eventually, I decided to try this one. So let's talk about downloading files, using them with Carbide Create, and some of the issues that you might run into. So for our purposes, there are two basic kinds of file formats for images. The first is what's called a bitmap image. A bitmap, like the name says, is composed of tiny little blocks, bits of color, and sometimes they're referred to as dots or pixels. You'll see, terminology like dots per inch, pixels per inch. These go into making up the overall photo. But unfortunately, for our purposes, in terms of CNC, they're not terribly useful because there's no information there for the CNC to use to guide where it's going to go. The second type of file is what's called a vector file. These are the ones we're actually interested in. They go by names like SVG, EPS, PDF is also a vector, and they're more useful to us because they're composed of nodes and paths. These give the Shapeoko something to guide, and it can go from one node to the next or follow a path very easily. It all breaks down into basically math. Now, by default, Carbide Create will import SVG files and DXF files, but sometimes you get things in, say, an EPS format or a PDF format, something that Carbide's not really familiar with. You can use then a program like Convert.io online to go ahead and convert those files from one format to another. It's pretty simple. Just choose your files. I'll choose this one, EPS file. And I can then tell it to convert into any of these formats. So I just choose SVG, ready, convert, and it will upload the file, convert it, and then all I have to do is download it. And we're done. So this is a pretty helpful site to have around and bookmarked. I'll have a link down in the doodly-doo. Okay, so let's get back to our actual project that we're going to run. So this is a brand new copy of Carbide Create. They've changed the interface on me again, but that's okay. I still know basically where things are. So I set this up as a 12 by 12 piece because that's the size of our stock. Our thickness is 0.23, not quite a quarter of an inch, but close. And everything else is set. MDF, inches, we're good. Tell that okay. And now I'm going to import our DXF file. Okay, and the first thing you can see is it is huge. And we're not going to be doing it that big. So now that I've imported, I've got everything in. First thing I'm going to do is group stuff, so I make sure that when I shrink things I don't lose them. So now that that's grouped, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to do scale. And it's at 40 inches. We don't want that. We want it right at about 12. So 12. And we apply. And then we have to go searching for it. So at this point what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my scroll wheel. Yeah. Pull out a little bit. Grab this guy and drag him down. I can also just click done and use my align vectors to align him to the stock. And just tell it I want it centered on both planes on the stock. So now I've got everything I need and I can reset my view. Now the one thing I want to look for this is little pink lines. Little pink lines will mean that there's an open vector, that they're not all closed, but fortunately I don't see any of those on here. If I do, I can adjust those with the vectors, but right now everybody looks good. So I can actually go directly from this and start creating my tool paths. So one of the fortunate things about having someone else's project, they've already done this before. So they make it fairly easy for you. So at this point, I can just select everything that's here. I can choose V-carve. I can go with my V-bit tool. And I can tell it okay. And I'm just going to leave that the way it is. It's going to calculate my time. And it's going to give me a time of 205 minutes. That's probably going to be overkill, but okay, we'll go with that for right now. The other thing I probably want to do in case of like a V-carve is to make sure that what I'm seeing is what I really want. So I'm going to turn off toolpath and rapids and just have it show me the simulation in MDF. And it's going to take a few minutes to calculate that. Okay, and that's our simulation. And that looks pretty good. That looks like we're going to get what we want with it. We'll get those black areas are where it's going to carve, and then the tan areas are where we're going to leave the stock alone. And that looks pretty much like exactly what we want. So we'll go ahead and save our G-code with that. So one thing you'll notice from the original file that we were looking at online is he had a very nice gold effect over a darker looking board. So I'll show you how to create that effect next. So here's what we're going to start with. This is a piece of black MDF. It's about 1/4 of an inch thick and about 12 by 12. I believe this came from the folks at Inventables, which is a good place. I'll put a link down in the doodly-doo. And what we need to do with this is we want to paint over the top of it so that when our bit goes through, we have the color of the paint where the bit didn't cut, and then the color of the MDF where the bit did. Now, the paint that I'm going to use for this is just a nice Rust-Oleum bright coat of metallic finish. This is like a coppery kind of gold looking stuff, and it makes a nice contrast with this, and that will give us our finish. All right, so what we end up with is a board that looks like this. Now, when you're putting on your coats of paint, go ahead and put them on, you know, fairly thin. Get a nice coat on it. Once you let that first coat dry, take a piece of steel wool or something like that and just kind of brush down the top of it. That'll get rid of the little nibs that kind of stand up on them. And then go ahead and do a second coat. And if you're feeling really frosty, same thing and do a third coat. I believe I stuck with 2 on this one, but that should give you what you need. Now we're going to do the blue tape method on this to hold it down, but I'm not going to do the entire board like I normally would, just because it's MDF, so it is not the most, the toughest stuff in the world. So I'm probably just going to do the edges, right, with the tape. And that way I should be able to get it up without destroying the board. Okay, so I've got my board mounted here. This is one of the reasons why I really like this grid line that I've done on my waste board, because that way I can line it up and I can know that this is square according to where the mill is going. So that way I don't end up with my pattern slightly off on this. So this is the point where we're going to start this, and you probably want to get a good book or something, because like I said, it's about 6 hours to go ahead and carve this. For anybody who's curious, I do monitor long cuts through a Wise Cam, and before the safety police freak out in my mentions, I don't recommend this for everyone. It's what works for me. Your tolerance for risk may vary. I monitor from another room, and I'm always right in the same area with the CNC machine, but I see no reason to stand over it like a Buckingham Palace guard. If you're someone who does that, that's perfectly fine for you. I hope you enjoy it. But for me, I'd rather monitor this thing remotely and take what I consider to be acceptable precautions. Okay, check this out. I think this is really cool looking. It's got a great texture to it. It's got a really nice depth to it. A couple of tiny things that I can see. Let's see if I can pull back a little bit. You'll notice just here at the bottom I got a little bit too far off on my measurement. So you can see some of that gold edge right there. I can just take that off with a hand plane and that'll be fine. But it does tell me to be a little more careful next time. Also, I noticed that this end kind of popped up a little bit. So I want to make sure next time that I'm glued down all the way on my edges and that everything is nice and flat. But overall, I'm really, really pleased with how this turned out. And the interesting thing you should draw from something like this is not just, okay, cool, I'm doing someone else's project, but it gives you some different opportunities. Like, what if I do this with, say, a nice big dragon design on something that is a red MDF with black paint? That might give me a really nice presentation on that. So with a project like this, it's often good afterwards to just kind of let your mind wander and think about not just the project itself, but the things that it was showing you. What kind of techniques were being used? What was the basic idea behind the project? So in this case, it's not just the design, which is very pleasing to the eye, but the idea to me of painting stuff and then etching over the paint. This is something that sign makers do all the time, but I don't know that I see it a lot in other people's designs. So this led me down a couple of paths. The first was to kind of play to my strengths. So I say to myself, self, are you thinking what I'm thinking? Let's take a bunch of different veneers like this, maple and walnut, alternate them, glue them all together into a nice little sheet, and put those down into the top of a box. The second one was a very much failed experiment with stacks of paper. As you can see, not all experiments turn out for the better, but I learned something. The last thing I tried, and something I'm going to play with a little bit more now, was the idea of using the V-bit to take off just the top layer of paint and use it more like, say, a fine tip pen. So in this experiment, I took a piece of MDF, I spray painted it some yellow and some orange, and then put a coat of white Kills over it and did a spirograph design on it. This turned out pretty good. I used a depth of 0.001, so I could probably even get away with less than that. But it's interesting to me to see the color poking through on the white background. Anyway, the idea with these projects is to try and bring something new in and inspire yourself a little bit. Hopefully I've been able to inspire you a little bit today. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.